Hello and welcome to a lock-in and the Crate and Crowbar. This week we're talking about tabletop role-playing games, what they are, why we like them, and why you should try some that aren't Dungeons and Dragons. I myself am a long-time goblin botherer, but joining me to discuss this auspicious topic is an even more storied adventurer in this mysterious narrative realm, a developer of both video games and tabletop games, known for founding Rock Paper Shotgun and Big Robot Games. Some call him the Dungeon Master. Some call him Hunt Daddy. Others still call him Jim. Welcome, Jim Rossignol.
Hello there.
Are you ready to join me on a journey of magic and wonderment, fantasy and joy?
Always, Marsh. Always with you, hand in hand, as ever.
Would you tell me a little bit about how you got into role-playing in the first place? Was it something you grew up with? You were a bit older than me, but I mean, I assume it was part of the cultural imagination as when you were a teenager, right?
I mean, it was actually pre-teen that I arrived on the scene. It was my slightly older cousins who had first edition Dungeons and Dragons books, and they just seemed so exciting to 9-year-old me. Do you remember the classic artwork on those? You've got like a kind of green cowled dungeon master opening a door with some fantasy landscape behind him, and just like amazing, powerful pieces of art. And then they had the monstrous compendiums and stuff full of hideous creatures and stuff. And my older cousin Steve, who, if you'd like to imagine Steve, is exactly the same as I am, with the same voice to the point where it's a bit uncanny. And he ran an adventure for myself and my other cousins, and I was just completely taken with it. And I immediately went off and bought a whole bunch of stuff with my pocket money, which I could make little sense of, but just loved anyway because it had maps and pictures of men with swords and beards. And shortly thereafter, I discovered Dragon magazine, which was basically the official Dungeons & Dragons magazine, although advertising a whole bunch of other stuff that I was to get into, was stocked at Cordair's newsagents in St Margaret's at Cliff, which was so I guess I was about 10 at that point, so having moved to Kent, and I bought it every month thereafter. And
I don't remember that magazine at all. It doesn't survive now, presumably.
I don't actually. I think it may do in some form. I haven't looked at it for many years, although I've kept my copies of the sort of early 90s,
Oh, wow.
sort of late 80s, early 90s era that I was buying it. That was my gateway.
Do you remember what happened in the adventure with Dungeon Master Cousin Steve?
We were in a tavern, and all I can remember is that there was a hideous creature, which I should know the name of, but I can't remember it offhand, which is one, and it's like a kind of a bunch of eyes and mouths all sort of mashed together in one hideous creature. And for some reason, that was in the corner of the room of the tavern we rented, and we stabbed it to death. That's all I can remember about it. But I also remember pre-picking the monster, like excitedly ruffling through the book and saying, "Can we fight this creature?" And Steve obliging, because he's an obliging chap. What a nice man Cousin Steve is.
How would you deal with that request as a dungeon master now? Can we fight a beholder in the corner of the tavern?
They haven't had this kind of from grown up audiences or grown up groups. You don't tend to get those because they don't tend to get that excited about monsters and want to fight them. My son is more of that kind of that age where he rifles through pages of the monstrous compendium and points out. There's a fantastic book actually, which is for the Numenera setting, which has just incredible monsters in it, and one of them is a giant with a portal to an alien city for a head. And my son saw that, and he just immediately taken with it, but didn't suggest that I ran a campaign with that in. He said he's going to use that for his own campaign with his friends. So I felt both, proud and rejected at the same time.
Oh, it's nice that you've passed the baton on to a new generation.
Yeah, it didn't feel like there was much baton passing really, actually, because I tried to get him into it, and I bought him. There are these like beginners Dungeons and Dragons books now that very much just explain like sort of settings and concepts, and the classic monsters and classic dungeons and character classes and things without really getting much into the rules and stuff. They're just these little hardbacks. So I bought him those and he got very excited about them and then just promptly forgot about it. But then he's gone to secondary school now. So there was this sort of point at which all this stuff that was sort of nerdy dad stuff on dad's shelves that was kind of interesting by virtue of being, swords and fantasy and monsters and stuff, suddenly became things that his actual peers were interested in. And so he's just gone off. And D&D's entered this phase now where it's sort of post nerd, like it's wrapped up with all these things that are cool. And so he just immediately launched into after school clubs. It's actually, I think it's like a town hall club, and he's off doing adventures and running adventures there. Which just seems like radically different to my experience as a 12-year-old
Yeah.
of sneaking into the geography class for him to secretly play Dungeons and Dragons at lunchtime.
I can't even imagine what my childhood would have been like if all the things I was into during my childhood had the kind of cultural cachet that they now do.
We would have been different people. And there was this amazing conversation that I had with him. He said to me, "Dad, why do people sometimes say that Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that is nerdy? Because it's not, is it?" And I didn't know whether to say, "Well, it is actually, you massive nerd," or to just like accept that, for a certain generation, they're moving away from that. I don't know. It was really kind of a tricky, maybe I should say, yeah, it's not nerdy, buddy, But at the same time, I'm sort of reliving all the kind of embarrassments of my own youth and my own nerdy interests. But yeah, definitely for his generation, it's a different thing. And seeing beautiful people streaming games, incredibly nerdy games on Twitch and stuff, it's a radically different landscape to the one we faced growing up.
What kind of form does it take for you now? I mean, I know the answer to this question because I'm part of that form. But I mean, do you tell us about your kind of role-playing regime, such as it is?
I mean, I think I had quite a long break, really. Probably sort of stopped at maybe 18 when I was into drinking and philosophy and cars and girls and stuff, and then didn't play for a long time. And then there was like a couple of brief campaigns. One run by a writer from Edge, Mark, whose second name I can't remember now. But anyway, he briefly ran a campaign for us back in the PC Gamer Edge eras of the early noughties. And then I didn't play for a few years. Then I played with some people who I'd known from university, who had been running a campaign for 10 years by that point. And it was the same campaign with the same characters.
And what, they just invited you into that campaign?
Yeah. And it was so overwhelming, and also required driving to Huddersfield once a month, which was just too much for me at that point. But yeah, it was incredibly it was just an extraordinary thing. And they were just unbelievably competent and just incredibly invested in this campaign that they'd written all the stories of, and the GM would even run individual solo campaigns for the players so they could flesh out their characters more and stuff. And I just thought, yeah, that's the nail in the head for me. I honestly at that point thought I was never going to play tabletop stuff again. So I thought, there's no way I can commit to something like that. And the amount of time and effort and preparation and almost like just homework and project work they were doing on it just made me think, yeah, that's it for me now. I'll never go back to it. But then a few years later, my wife, out of the blue, asked me to run a campaign for her friends. And I think you and Graham Smith and John Walker and James Carey were also interested in around the same time. And that was probably pushing 10 years ago now, is it? I don't know.
Maybe even more, actually, yeah.
Yeah, it was a long time ago now. But that suddenly made me think, what people are really interested in this stuff. And I should spend £500 on Dungeons and Dragons books and maps and shit, which I promptly did.
Yes, you should. That was a wise purchase.
Which I used in those two campaigns. Man, that was those campaigns because I'd had like this pent up desire to get back and play, be Dungeon Master again and to get into that stuff. I just launched into it with like the fervor of an addict denied for decades, and the campaign that I ran for Amanda, my wife, and the campaign that I ran for you guys were both in the same world, and you were seeing the aftermath of each other's. Even if you didn't know it, and it pleased me to know that the two campaigns were interwoven. You were like crossing paths in that world, and I had this kind of idea for some kind of denouement where you were fighting on different planes, but what you did affected each other. And we never got there, of course, because both campaigns ran out of steam before my extravagant plans could come to pass. Also, I did the most ambitious single scene that I've ever run in a TTRPG in that, which was that Wizards released this grid map. I don't know how much we used the grid maps playing with you. I can't remember.
Quite a bit.
But one of them was like sort of a tile-based one with small tiles. I think it was an official Dungeons and Dragons one. It might have been one of the sort of other spin-off ones. But I built the map so that they had to escape across the city. This was for Amanda's group. But I was going to try and do something similar with you. And I took apart the map and then rebuilt it ahead, almost like a scrolling video game map over the course of a 3-hour session as they battled across the map. It was fucking amazing. I was well impressed with myself. But I don't think anyone around the table was even remotely like cognizant of like how ambitious it was, or even gave the slightest shit because they were just chatting away and looking at their phones.
Well, that's part of the magic of particularly you as a GM, because you are very skillful at covering up what stuff you've pre-prepared and what stuff you're improvising. And sometimes, I'd ask you at the end of a session, so how much time do you spend preparing that? You're like, oh no, I just winged it. Like, well, that seemed incredibly convoluted and precise in a way which I didn't imagine could be just conjured. But that's why you're a wizard, Jim, you see.
I think it's much easier to. We'll come to talk about what the systems we're playing, but the sort of systems that I like playing now, they're much more enabling for that kind of play. Like playing D&D without any prep is possible, but man, it's you've got to know your shit, and it's much harder. You want to plan encounters and know how many goblins are a suitable number to throw at your party. And if winging that is not easy, and I wouldn't have attempted to do that in the same way. The art of doing this stuff is always, because players are always going to throw a spanner in the works. That's the joy of it, is that it doesn't matter what you prepare, really. The players are always going to walk in the other direction, or they're always going to punch the friendly guy in the face or set fire to the building or whatever else. You have to improvise to some degree. But yeah, I certainly think in D&D you want to have a handful of encounters and possible situations ready to go. You want to know the stats of the NPC that they may or may not pick a fight with, and even if you think they aren't going to, they will, and then you've got to deal with that. It's funny. I was talking to another friend recently about this improv stuff, and he remarked that, as you have very kindly, that I kind of that it's seamless when I'm sort of improvising. But I've always found that the most delightful thing, where these games are basically a conversation. And how ideas just get spontaneously generated as you're talking to someone. That conversation is a sort of spontaneous activity that sort of generates stuff or generates itself. But I find tabletop sessions are very much the same. So it's the stuff that the players do, the ridiculous decisions that people make, or just the incredible, intelligent kind of acts they perform that you're not expecting. That's why it's so alive and so compelling to keep coming back to, is because it isn't just the sort of static unfolding of a story. It is always this response, like to you try to set up the most interesting situation you can, but it's always how players explode that is the really exciting part.
Yeah, I think that campaign was my way back into role playing as well. I had taken a break. I can't remember when I stopped role playing, but I think I'm not sure. I was maybe just an early teenager when I stopped, and I probably got absorbed into Warhammer for a bit after that, and then spat back out into video games. I didn't really go back to it until that campaign. But
Yeah, I had a couple of friends who always wanted to role play during my teenage years, so it lasted until we were probably 17 or 18, and we played a bunch of different things. And I would buy quite a variety of stuff. So we played a bunch of the Palladium games, which were all terrible, like Rifts and stuff like that. We played lots of the different D&D settings. Played a bunch of Mech Warrior. I don't know if you're aware of Mech Warrior. That's become, I think it's the BattleTech stuff. Obviously, you will be aware of it from the video games, but obviously that started out as an RPG board game. What else did we play? Yeah, a whole bunch of kind of like that early stuff. And I would buy some just completely random things as well, that we would maybe play for one session, and that would be the new hotness, and I would be into that for a bit, and then completely forget about it. And then I did, but I, as you say, did get derailed from the beautiful theatre of the mind RPG stuff into Games Workshop's siloed and obsessive space war imagery, painting space marines and all that kind of stuff as well, which I still dabble in now, of course, because who can really give it up?
And for you, from there into game journalism and game development, right?
Yeah, and I didn't.
Do you feel like there's a through line there? I mean,
I didn't actually. I thought there was a bit of a disconnect for a while. I think I talked to Kieran Gillen a while back, who was just produced an RPG of his own based on his comic, which is a sort of meta commentary on RPGs. Die. Die is one of those puns. It seems really clever the first time, and as the more and more I say it, the more kind of like, God, what that's such a Kieran pun. To the point of it being almost painful. I was talking to him about this recently, and he was saying how early on he always placed these things in different categories. Board games are separate from TTRPGs, separate from digital games, and so on. And now doesn't feel like that at all, and is very much aware of the overlap. And I think that's how I'm feeling as well now. Like, I can really see how the forms of one just bleed directly into another, and that it is part of a continuous landscape of this activity. And certainly work that I've done in the last couple of years has been directly informed. I say digital games work that I've done in the last couple of years has been directly informed by the kind of learning and exploration that I've had from learning this new wave of RPGs that we've been playing the last few years. And how could it not be, really? Like, I think, that kind of work, like the creative work, design work, it's always going to benefit from cross-pollination. And there are a whole bunch of compatible ideas in that stuff. And so, I think I definitely tried to keep it compartmentalized for whatever reason.
Well, I wonder if it's just because the two sort of ways of dealing with narrative have become closer and closer the more sophisticated video games have got. Like, I mean, previously they're very prescriptive, right? Whereas now there's a whole multiplayer social games that kind of tap into the same sort of improvisational shared storytelling nature of role playing, which wasn't the case. So, even things which are CRPGs, computer role playing games, are all very prescriptive methods of storytelling, where the narrative is pre-written and you can sort of move through it like a pachinko ball through a pachinko set, but you're not actually improvising or changing anything. And it's weird that, in fact, the things that claim to be RPGs are possibly the least like actual tabletop role-playing games in a weird way, whereas something with a kind of much more free-form social space, like just fucking about in Minecraft with your mates, that in fact that is perhaps more like free-form actual tabletop role-playing than some of the things which bear its name.
Yeah. To go back to my son's stuff, actually, for a minute, one of the things I've been most fascinated about his journey in games, because Minecraft was obviously one of the first games that he played, and I think, fucking hell, how is that going to change your consciousness and understanding of games if Minecraft is the first game that you play? This game that in itself is incredibly built on recombination and has more mods than the rest of gaming put together. Like the the possibility space that you must immediately understand games as being from playing that. But like one of the things that they do a lot is they play on roleplay servers in Minecraft, and then invent their own roleplay systems based on combinations of mods that they've shonked together on their own Minecraft server, which is that's an incredible kind of mutant of tabletop RPG and digital gaming. And I it's just that's going to become more prevalent over time, I should think, as that kind of stuff becomes easier.
Should we talk a bit about D&D itself? Dungeons and Dragons, the
Mm.
big one, the big kahuna.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've over the past few years, as I've got more into the indie game scene, you can see, not just the indie game scene, but like just the wider RPG scene. It's interesting because you can see both the unbelievable dominance of that as a form. I think it's something like 90% of games played are D&D games, and also this sense of elitism amongst those people who don't play it, who want people to play other stuff and regards themselves as this kind of this sort of this sort of sect apart from D&D that that are exploring what's truly valuable or interesting about which I don't think is necessarily true, because there's loads of cool stuff in D&D, but it's interesting to watch the kind of like factionalism and elitism stuff that always circulates around there being a mainstream, and then like the sort of smaller cult interests, down to this sort of battle between whether D&D or Pathfinder, which are two remarkably similar games, like which is the one that you would rather play and which is the best of those, and that kind of like, I don't play D&D, I play Pathfinder kind of thing, which I find slightly bemusing in a the idea that the swords and sorcery stat-based RPGs are, there's enough to. I mean, I'll probably get murdered by Pathfinder fans for saying this, but there's enough to within that to get into an argument about the distinction between them.
They're both the same and they're both shit. That's what you're saying.
Yes, no, they're both fine. They're both lovely, Marsh, and we
Yeah,
love them both.
I mean, I'm one of the people who is slightly frustrated by the dominance of D&D, simply because it has this sort of monopoly position, not out of any particular kind of malign financial death grip in the way that monopolies exist in like technology or stuff, but it just seems to be this snowballing effect where its prominence just creates a greater and ever greater inertia, which prevents people from escaping it. And that's sort of frustrating, because there are lots of different ways in which you can role play, and I think there are more freeform and exciting ways. But I do really like a lot of the things about D&D. Like people talk about it being crunchy. I mean, maybe it's worth thinking a little bit about what crunchiness means. I mean, do you have a take on what is crunchy about D&D?
I mean, I think what's interesting is, and this goes across a lot of games, is how much people enjoy seeing numbers go up and seeing abilities expand and throwing more dice onto the table, or having more points appear on their UI, or there is a sense of people really enjoy seeing systems work and systems collide together and have output, um, and D&D has this, loads of dice, loads of stats, loads of spells, there's loads of possible systems that are going to mash together. It's a very sort of combat orientated game, and there is something incredibly satisfying about that. And I think there's a reason why dice and chance and numbers have all become part of the core experience of RPGs, because crunchiness is rewarding and also interesting to sort of work with, interesting to think about, interesting to kind of do your homework on while away on what would be better, this selection of equipment or spells, but it is really rewarding. It's one of the things that we know is compelling about game design and gets built into a lot of games. And I think there is a loop between, video game design and D&D in terms of the way that stuff works and why players find it compelling and interesting. But I think it also kind of it hooks up with the other thing that you were saying in terms of it becoming this sort of inertia driven monster. I was reaching for the word colossi, but thought of it too late to include it in the flow of speech. So can we let's use colossi because it's a much better, or colossus. I don't know. Anyway, it's the fact that people have to learn quite a bit to grasp D&D. Like there's quite a lot of rules there. You're learning what your character does, what the race of your character, also does, what abilities they have, how abilities advance over time, what skills and attributes you have, what weapons you have, how the armor does stuff, and how it all impacts on the dice you're going to roll. And it's a sort of there's a sense of mastery there, right? Like you can learn how to play your character really well. But there's also quite a big buy-in to learning all that stuff. And I think one of the things that we've discussed, and it's certainly something that gets discussed quite a bit around this topic, is the fact that once people have played D&D and learned that stuff, there becomes this huge sunk cost fallacy of, oh my goodness, I've learned how to play D&D and it was a lot, so I don't want to have to learn another game system because it's going to be as much again, right? Which isn't really true in most cases. And even in the systems that are very different, quite a few of the same principles will apply, or the system will just have fewer moving parts. So you won't be dealing with quite as much stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons why D&D has held its grip, is because people make that judgment and they play it, they learn it, they're rewarded by that crunchiness, they get into that, but they also are burdened by this enormous amount of knowledge that they've accrued in mastering that, and that feeds back into, I will stick with D&D rather than learn something else.
It's also because one of the main ways in which D&D has reached its level of popularity is through streamers as a sort of performance art. And obviously, as performers, they want their performance to be legible to an audience. So they're not going to suddenly move to a new system which the largest part of their audience doesn't comprehend. They're going to use something which is familiar. And that just drives the snowball to accrue even more snow.
Yes, there's a lot of snow involved, and I don't, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Right? I think fluency within games is really important. And being able to understand what you see on a screen is, one of the key things to being involved. And I think it does have a kind of knock-on effect for what people put in games and what they design. In fact, I was just having a conversation this morning with a designer who was saying that the system they had designed was unlike how other games do it, and consequently was questioned by everyone who saw it. They went, "Oh, that's weird. Why are you doing that?" Because it wasn't like how other games did it. But it was designed for a very specific reason, which, once you got past it being odd, made it more useful and improved the game overall. But the feedback was always, "Oh, that's odd. I would do it like other games do it." And you can see how that kind of comes across there, right? Like, because people have a level of fluency within games, they will always apply the knowledge they already have, and that can end up sort of removing innovation because it makes it's easier and faster to you've got the shorthand there to do it like another game did it. And that's true of D&D. I think like there are a lot of games that have basically followed that template. That follow very much the same structure of having the set of attributes that describe the character's capabilities and working with levels so that characters level up over time. All those kind of things that have been made comprehensible by learning how to play D&D then have a knock-on effect on how other games that get made function, right? So Pathfinder might be a better D&D, but it is still using a template that it is, that it has evolved from or inherited from. And I think that's true across a bunch of games. So sometimes it takes quite a big leap to get out of that mindset, because it's how you've been educated and how you've come to understand. Like, I still balk at RPGs that don't have dice in, which I've played a few of over the last couple of years, and stuff like RPGs that have no GM, and things like that. I still struggle with some of those, even though some of them have been some of the coolest experiences I've had in tabletop RPGs over the past few years. I've still kind of bounced off the form being different to what I'd been trained to expect it to be. You see what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, yeah, and likewise, I'm a bit leery about stuff which is like solo RPGs, journaling RPGs. Those sorts of experiments don't grab me in quite the same way. I think I like the happenstance that is thrown upon you by using dice. Like, I think if you take the dice out of D&D, it becomes just pure storytelling then, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I think so. I played a game, not with our group, but with a group that with Gillen and a couple of others. We played this game called Thistle and Hearth, which is derivative of another rule set that I embarrassingly can't remember the name of. Belonging, Outside Belonging, I think it's called. And that is diceless and GMless, but it does have a really specific set of moves, right? Like a bunch of things that you can do, and and sort of trigger points at which you should do those things. And so even outside it being diceless, there was a sense of rules derived structure to it that definitely made it a game,
Yeah.
even as it was about telling a story in a communal and cooperative way. And it wasn't always cooperative, actually. Like, there was some elements of antagonism, and but I found that super interesting, but still struggled with the idea of there not being that element of chance, and there not being the roll of the dice that I'd come to expect. But that's interesting in itself, right? In that we've now hit a point where tabletop RPGs are just flying off over the boundaries that we'd set for them, and moving into other places that definitely aren't Dungeons and Dragons.
Maybe we should talk about a few of the other systems that are out there.
Yes. What would you like to talk about, Marsh Davis?
Well, in a note in this in this document we have, it says maybe we should start with the Palladium games / Rifts.
Yeah, I mean, the Palladium games / Rifts were the thing that I moved to after D&D as a teenager. So that they were advertised regularly in Dragon magazine, and they had cool art, and they had the like power armor and mutants and things like that. And they were my first taste of there being anything other than Dungeons and Dragons, which was formative for me, particularly, and Rifts, which a lot of 90s RPG kids will remember as being one of the genre bending or genre blending, maybe, games that came out at that point. I absolutely loved, because it would put wizards versus power armor, or a dragon fighting a robot, or people just careening off into other dimensions, and techno Nazis versus hippie wizard guys. And one of the characters was just crazily pumped up on drugs but would die after 5 years, and stuff like this. And it was one of those games that it was not good. It was probably objectively bad, but it just threw so much stuff at the wall, right? That there were these huge books full of guns and aliens and robots and underground cities and vampire collectives and Mad Maxian speed tribes and gargoyles fighting mechs and demons from Atlantis enslaving people and taking them to other worlds and all this kind of, and it had this kind of like Lovecraft through to sci-fi bullshit. It just tried to encompass everything, and I just loved the fact that it had blown up genre boundaries, which I'd always found I'd always found genres. I think as a kid I was quite a genre fascist. I was very much kind of like, sword games are sword games and gun games are gun games, and I can remember as a kid being irritated by the 18th century because it had guns and swords. Right? It's just like, why? That's a terrible period of history. Like, it should either be exciting automatic weapons or knights hitting each other with swords. There shouldn't be this in between phase. It's just messy. But of course, as a teenager, I was super into the rules being blown up and there not being any. Unfortunately, the actual rules, the dice rolling rules of the Palladium games were interminable. They were just the worst. To the point where actually the guy that I played the most rifts with as a teen actually remade a bunch of that stuff as a D20 system that he came up with himself, which I'm not sure what happened to, but I later learned that Palladium were really aggressive in going after fan sites and shutting them down. And I don't know whether that happened to him. Maybe.
Wow,
I must get in touch with him one day and find out, because we were huge Palladium fans, but we knew that the system was bad and ended up rebuilding it. But I think once I played Rifts and I'd had that sort of genre shattering moment, and also I'd realised that their rule set wasn't set in stone, and I could just move on from that, and I could play with it, and I could play with the rule set, and I could hack the system and do something different. It massively opened up what I was interested in and what I expected from RPGs. So while I can't recommend those games to anyone, they were absolutely critical to me and have remained super influential.
I've got a list of other games here, but I imagine we haven't probably played all of them or played all of them in depth, but it's probably maybe worth just name checking them, going through them and saying what we know of them.
Sure.
Traveller is at the top of the list. I think this is actually one of the first games I played, strangely, because it has a reputation as being kind of fussy and complicated, and probably not the kind of thing you'd play as a preteen or however old I was. I think I was at like some kind of summer school or something. I had it's a very confusing memory tied up with a bowel complaint I got from some tainted pottery class.
Wow, that's a very specific memory. Interesting.
But I don't really recall very much about the actual system itself. But I do remember being mesmerized, basically, by the idea of inhabiting science fiction, which was just the entire concept of that. For some reason, like I guess because I probably played some Warhammer Fantasy roleplay at that point. Or at least I was more familiar with fantasy as a role play setting. That the idea of just having a space setting itself was incredibly novel and eye opening to me. Did you ever encounter Traveller?
I have a copy of Traveller right here on my shelf, right next to me, which I've never played actually. And I think this is the modern reprint or the modern rewrite or edit or something of the original Traveller. And it's certainly the original cover art, but it's a more recent printing. And I read it and was kind of put off by its fastidious ruliness, and I think it came from it's that sort of earlier era of very rulesy games, of which there are many, and get those sort of games still get produced. The only thing I can remember about Traveller actually is that it was possible to die during character creation in the original the original rule set, because I think basically you created your character, and the process of creating it was to roll on a bunch of tables that sort of describe their history and what had happened to them and things like that. And death was one of the things that could have happened to them that was formative.
Yes, I imagine so.
Which I think got, if I remember correctly, it got removed from later editions, much to the outcry of the Traveller fan base, understandably.
Oh, they should still include that in character creation in computer role playing games. Like you can put the kind of like your stats at any level you like, but there's a certain threshold below which you've already died.
They sort of do. In Dragon Age 2, I think it was, my wife spent about 2 days making her character and then accidentally backed out of the menu without saving it, and never went back to the game because she was so angry that it had reset this meticulously crafted character that she'd made.
Oh, there you go. Recreating the authentic Traveller experience, certainly.
Yeah.
I've got Vampire the Masquerade down as well, which is one of the kind of games which has probably more of a mind share in the general populace alongside D&D, probably because the video games.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm never certain about Vampire. Like, obviously it seems to have. I feel like it has a profile that outweighs its actual its actual population. Like I think fewer people play it than a bunch of other games, or it feels like it, but yet its profile is quite high. I think it's because it was one of the first RPGs that seemed a bit cool.
Very edgy.
Yeah, there was a sense of like edginess and modernity to it, wasn't there? I think there were a few of those games, like Cyberpunk and Shadowrun and a few others, that just were just a bit cooler than the nerdy Dungeons and Dragons stuff that we had been playing. We're a bit more urban, we're a bit more aware, perhaps a bit more politically aware. And also I think the generation that were playing them had perhaps grown up a little bit more. It wasn't necessarily teens that were playing it by that point. I mean, I'm speculating here because I never got into the vampire scene, and the people who played it frightened me when I was at university. So I don't know. I can't vouch for Vampire. I did buy the Masquerade recently. I think it was just like the 4th edition of it or something that came out recently, and even now struck me as basically being a bit too cool. Too cool for me. I'm not sure I can run something that is quite as slick and attractive as that. I need it to be a little bit more lumpen and goblinoid for me to make sense of it.
There's something a little bit disquieting in its edginess, because it encourages you to. You are bad creatures. You're evil. You're vampires, and the extent to which it encourages you to lean into being, I'm really dead evil. I am.
But I can see why the edginess would appeal, right? And I can see why that would give it a greater cultural cachet than being a wizard. But yeah, I sort of agree on that count.
Well, it's the difference between being a rapscallion, as you are in many of these games, or or somebody who lives outside the law and maybe doing bad things, but then Vampire seems to lean into fairly kind of large scale indulgences of fascism. And,
there is being a true Dark Lord in quite an embarrassing way.
Yeah, it's like people who get a little too into claiming their allegiance with the Sith or Slytherin or stuff like that. It means like, oh, you're the twat faction. Okay, got it.
We've always had close encounters with those people.
Yeah,
none of which will be listening to this podcast, I am certain.
I'm sure, of course. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I played this back in the day. I have actually the rule book back home, which I meant to bring you last time I was going from my parents' house to Bath, but I forgot. It's got a very distinctive cover of a variously Mohicaned fantasy people cleaving each other.
Oh yes, I love that. Yes. In fact, I had a discussion with Chris Gardner from Fellbetter Games and Kieran Gillen about what an amazing cover that is.
Oh,
Like,
it's
you know
fantastic.
exactly what you're getting with Mohican dudes beating people with axes.
Well, there's particularly, I think there's a dwarf with a massive orange Mohican who is slicing an orc from neck to sternum with his axe, and I think that was like the most gruesome thing I'd ever seen at age 11 or something like that.
And how
Yeah.
compelling was that, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
yes, I
I'm
want to
gonna
be a
play that.
dwarf that slices orcs from temple to sternum.
As far as the actual system goes, again, that has vanished into the mist of time. I think at the time it was very much based on D&D in that it was very statsy and crunchy, and there were like pages and pages and pages for
Yeah, it was definitely a very
different,
formal system as far as I can remember. Yeah.
yeah, over defining every kind of possible
Mm.
weapon you could have for sure. But now they've moved away from that system, I think, to Genesis. Is that right?
As yeah, I'm gonna say yes, but I'm sure someone will correct us if that's not correct. The Genesis. So the Genesis system, the game that I've heard the most reports of with using the Genesis system, and thought about playing, but actually we did play the Genesis system, but we played something else, which we'll talk about in a second. So the system that seems to have brought most attention to it was the last Star Wars role playing game, which I believe a member of this podcast, Mr.
Indeed,
Thurston, ran a campaign of.
he did indeed. I
Is
think
that a
it's still
campaign?
going.
Oh, right, okay. It's not a campaign you played it
No, no, no.
then. Yeah, and so that's definitely what brought the Genesis manual to the attention of people, or Genesis system, I should say. But there is a system agnostic manual, which I can't find. I was looking for it earlier. I think I've loaned it to a game designer who has never given it back to me. And yeah, so that was a system agnostic, and just kind of fascinating because it was a dice pool system without numbers. So it's dice of a polyhedral nature, but each one has symbols on it, and the symbols represent essentially different. It's a currency of sorts, more like a sort of narrative currency, isn't it? And you sort of read the bones, you interpret the symbols to work out what's happened after any given action, which was super interesting, I think. But I think our group ended up just deciding it was superfluous to, like, they may as well have been numbers kind of thing,
Mm.
and actually slowed down the process of us figuring out what went wrong. Like, rolling a 6 would be a success kind of thing. That's more sensible than, look, we've got this symbol, which means great, and then 2 other bonuses that, it just kind of, it was a weird kind of, like, I can see exactly what they were going for, and it was super interesting, and it was super iconic, and it had this kind of incredible sense of playing with something new and interesting, and was nevertheless a kind of speed bump that we didn't need or want.
Yeah. It's almost like they had the right idea, but they didn't actually go quite far enough in terms of
Yeah,
that
because they
narrative.
took that dice system and essentially built it into quite a traditional stats and rule based
Mm.
system that went quite granular in terms of the things that it provided, statistics and and not the way combat work was meticulously broken down into phases and actions you could perform and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, again, quite kind of bitty and rulesy and formal. Which, when they were going for something that would support narrative play, seemed like the wrong direction.
Am I right in thinking that we played Dark Heresy, the Warhammer 40,000
Mm.
roleplay setting with the Genesis rules? Is that the thing that
Yes,
we
yeah,
attached
yes.
Genesis to?
So Dark Heresy, the actual Dark Heresy is some kind of monstrous D100 system from Fantasy Flight Games, I believe, and it's one of the most extraordinary hardback, full color RPG book beasts with rules for absolutely everything, like falling from the back of a moving horse, or standing in oil, or all these just kind of like incredibly specific situations, and then having to roll percentage based scores that have multiple modifiers applied to them. I was talking to someone about this recently. I say recently; it's probably 2 years ago now, because I'm reaching that kind of like, and like middle age where I say recently, but actually mean a decade ago. About that in a sort of thematically, the D100 system being baroque and forbidding is like thematically consistent with the 40k universe.
Yeah, I guess.
And like like it wants to sort of punish you and make it difficult and incredibly Byzantine to even play. But I wanted to kind of get around that because I really wanted to play a 40k game. Or rather, me and Alex Wiltshire wanted to play a 40k game, and we wanted to drag everyone else along with us. I feel like the rest of the group were fairly indifferent as to whether.
Oh no, I was into it. I was into it.
Good. Well, yeah. So we found a community hack which converted the whole thing to Genesis, and there was some really fun stuff in there, and it was interesting. And we did manage to complete the full arc. I was proud of us actually because we did the full chapter of the adventure that I planned for it. And it worked fairly well. But yeah, there's it's freely available online. Actually, there's a whole PDF of a community driven Dark Heresy, which is converted to Genesis. They've done the whole manual, and the last I checked, we're also working on Rogue Trader, which I was actually what I wanted to run, because I think the Rogue Trader RPG setting, because it releases you from the constraints of being an Imperial agent. Although you're still associated with the Imperium. In Dark Heresy, you are an Inquisitor's acolyte, so you have to be imperially, basically. Which I'm not sure all of our group really bought into. Like, there wasn't a kind of buy-in to being mutant crushing heretic stabbers, which I don't think quite worked for the tone of the thing. And so I think Rogue Trader would have been better, because we would have been able to do the crew of spaceship thing, and the whole crew of spaceship thing is really, I think is a great setup. It's a great setup actually that we have never managed to pull off as a group.
Yeah.
Because we played Scum and Villainy, which we went after a couple of episodes. We did Dark Heresy, which didn't quite work as a crew of spaceship thing, and we played Mothership, which we should talk about in a minute. So indie RPG Mothership, which also we bounced off the rules for. Although I feel like we had the best time with that out of those three.
Yeah,
I strongly want to come back to that. Actually, that's my kind of it's one
Mothership.
of my. It's yes, because Mothership will be getting like its proper first edition after the Kickstarter, of which has within which they've revised a whole bunch of the rules. And the previews we've read of that make that look really exciting, because it feels like they've really understood the difficulties that people had with it, and the stuff that was opaque, or like there were lots of things, like lots of similar terms for stress or fear or whatever, that would easily confuse both player and GMs, and they seem to have addressed a bunch of that stuff, and also created a bunch of tools for it actually being a proper campaign setting with character development working over multiple arcs and things like that, which I think could be really, really interesting. So yes, I do intend. I backed that Kickstarter. I was quite excited about it, and do intend to bring that to the table in the next year or so. And not just because we had a good time with the original Mothership, and I think it really captured some horror stuff, because I don't play a lot of horror games, right? Like, we rarely run things that are purely horror based, even if there's some horrible stuff that happens in our campaigns and stuff. Call of Cthulhu is the second most popular RPG I discovered recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That is interesting, isn't it? So, like, and that's something I've never even touched on. I've never played it, know nothing about it. All I know is that they call the GM a keeper. That's it. That's all I know about it.
I played some of the board games, but I assume they don't have that much interaction with the actual role-playing system.
Yeah, couldn't tell you. I mean, clearly it's one of those ones that's sort of based on insanity and stress of encountering the creatures and getting exposed to the cosmic horrors and stuff. But as a system, apparently hugely popular. I think probably more in the US, where the sort of Lovecraftian mythos has maybe more of a hold than it does in Europe.
That's weird. I mean, I haven't even seen that much sort of streamer stuff about Call of Cthulhu.
I mean, I'm basing this on stats from portals that run games online, like Roll20 and things like that.
Oh, wow.
And that is the second most played game, as far as I remember.
Interesting.
Is,
Well, maybe we should take a look at that
which is
at some
interesting.
point.
Yeah, I mean, I am a kind of a sucker for that stuff. I do like that sort of that aesthetic. So it would be interesting. Yeah.
You've also written Modifius D6 down here, which is a couple of words I'm not familiar with in that combination.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's not a system that we've run. I was basically just writing down the books that I have on my shelf. So the D6 system is Mr. Stalenhag inspired Tales from the Loop games. So there's Tales from the Loop and things from the Flood, which are kind of Stranger Thingsy type games where in Tales from the Loop you play as some kids, and there's a whole bunch of kind of school kid based mechanics in there, like the kids can't die, for example. They're going to be incapacitated and things like that, and then you become teenagers in things from the flood, and you can die, and so on. There's loads of really interesting and cool stuff in there. In one of those games you get to play a theme song which allows you to overcome all odds and things like that. And there's just really funny, interesting stuff in it because it's both Swedish and American settings in there. So it's got like a list of what jock and nerd names are in Swedish, and stuff like that. So yeah, so their D6 system is spread across a bunch of games that I own but have never run. So those games, I think the Forbidden Lands games as well. Forbidden Lands is super interesting. Probably haven't got time to cover it here really, but like a sort of classic, very tropey fantasy game, but using that D6 dice pool system. But also is in an attempt to do quite an open-ended system. And it comes with this incredible map, which has stickers with it so that you can put stickers on the map for the stuff you discover as you explore. So like if you find a ruined castle, you can stick the ruined castle on the map so that you know where it is and stuff like that. It's just really nice.
That's nice.
And Coriolis as well, which is their kind of Arabian Nights type space epic game that used that system. But yeah, sadly never played that one. So that's all I can say about it for now.
Numenera. Chris Thurston ran a campaign of this for I can't remember who else was in it. I think probably Graham and one of the Toms. I forget which, but it was that was very good. The thing I liked most about it was the way it generated artifacts. It's set in a very distant future where many civilizations have risen to space age levels of technology and then collapsed back on themselves. And so the Earth is just this massively scarred mess of distant civilizations, which are also of a level of technology which is completely beyond that of the player's understanding. And so it's kind of this weird mix of things which are high tech but also sort of folding into myth and misunderstanding, and you come across these artifacts and you can sort of you roll against various different tables to assemble their properties, and the kinds of things that system generates are just really exciting, and they're often like not obviously useful, and I find not obviously useful things the most exciting items to have in role-playing games, because you can it's then down to your ingenuity of how you apply these things, and that was very exciting. There's also a sort of a currency system, I think, where you sort of you trade back and forth with the GM tokens, which enable you to enact things with greater effect, but also allow the GM to punish you with greater effect, or throw obstacles in your path at a later point. You sort of trading back and forth. I think that's quite exciting as well.
Yeah, I think that kind of what I've termed narrative currency mechanic is finding its way into lots of different games. So that kind of, like, as you say, trading back and forth, trading for advantage, accepting sort of narrative bargains to get out of sticky situation stuff finds its way into lots of different games now in lots of different ways, and that's one of the things that I've post kind of like the wave of traditional RPGs that into sort of more modern RPGs and sort of the sort of post D&D stuff. That kind of innovation is one of the ones I found most interesting. Numenera is not one I've actually run. I've got tons of the source books and things for it because it's just so beautiful. Like
good art.
They are extraordinary, and just not just in the sort of art and production value of the books, but just the ideas that the monsters are incredible. There's a book that's just a huge compendium of those weird artifacts, and as you say, like a lot of them are just super funny and weird and interesting things. And so, I just want to be able to play a game where I throw some of those in there. Just weird objects that do unexpected things, and because you can see the kind of sparks for which they're gonna the sort of creative ideas that they're going to be, you can see how the players are going to riff off those and come up with weirdly improvised solutions for things based on having access to this sort of eccentric portfolio of equipment. And I really like that in RPGs, and I think Numenera is one that does that particularly well. Although I do think it's quite formidable as a setting. One of the things that we as a group I think have struggled with a little bit is any setting that requires the players to know quite a bit about the setting. So that was one of the things that we had with 40k, is we had two people who didn't really know anything about the Warhammer universe. And so we had to kind of come up with reasons why their players didn't know anything about that universe. But it didn't always make for smooth gaming. And I sense that Numenera might have similar issues, where it is such a rich universe. It puts quite a heavy cognitive load on the GM to know and understand factions and characters and different types of monsters and artifacts and all the rest of it. There's a lot there, and it would be great to put some of that load on the players, but that's not always a thing that they can do. Like, not everyone necessarily has access to the source books, all that kind of stuff. It becomes that's the reason I've never run it, because it looks formidable to put together and play.
I think all of these role-playing settings are made much easier if you can cast your characters as people who are interlopers in a setting they're unfamiliar with, because otherwise you have to believe, you have to put yourself in the headspace of a character who understands things that you as a player just simply don't have any familiarity with.
True. However, and I want to move us on at this point to the game that we have found to be the daddy, is that we have played maybe 2 campaigns of Blades in the Dark at this point. And there is something about that campaign and the setting and the way it's set up that has removed that barrier of entry. Like, people just get it. They just understand the setting. I think everyone I played Blades in the Dark with has sort of understood the assignment of scoundrels in this dishonored sort of doomed city, and it doesn't take a lot to set up the fact that you're criminal gangs fighting over the resources in the city, and it is quite a complex fiction, like the way that death works within it, and the spirits becoming trapped, and ghost hunters having to burn the spirits, or all that stuff. There's loads there, but you are scoundrels in a heist movie is so well supported by the game as a rule set that it coheres really quickly, and people seem to understand what to do. And I think it's one of those things where everyone is on the same page very quickly, which I wasn't expecting of it, right? Because it's not generic in the same way as like, oh, we're Marines in an Aliens game, or we're a wizard and a paladin going down into a dungeon. It's slightly off-brand, but everyone kind of buys into it and very quickly understands, how to be a scoundrel and how to play, which I think has made it a delight. It's made it. It's been the surprise of the last 10 years for me. And even when I read the book, I was not convinced. I was like, I just can't see how this is going to work at the table. And as soon as we played it, it lit up, and even the first session was absolute magic. And I feel like it's the culmination of a whole bunch of stuff, including that kind of narrative currency thing, the narrative currency and that being stress for your character, which you build up and have to manage and reduce, and can end up knocking your character out of the game completely. And I think all of those things coming together, that it just provided this kind of previously unplumbed depth of RPG experience, which has been incredibly rewarding. What did you feel like? Can you remember what when, because you hadn't played Blades at all or read the rules or anything?
No,
What
I
was
can't
your
remember.
impression of it when we started playing?
I think, what did we move from? Had we just played a D&D campaign just prior to that?
I don't think we had played together for a while before that, because you weren't part of the first campaign. In fact,
No,
we played
indeed,
two.
yeah.
In fact, we played two campaigns before you joined the group, and
Yes.
then you joined.
And then we've had the subsequent two. Yeah, I mean, I found it incredibly easy to get into. And I think this is one of the things that makes me a frustrated evangelist for systems other than D&D, is because I approached it with some trepidation for the same reasons that people are often put off learning new systems. But it was just so intuitive, and not only intuitive, but it was the system itself is thrilling to engage with for reasons which are adjacent to what I was saying about the items in Numenera, where they aren't, they're not very obviously applicable. In Blades, one of the things which is most delightful about it is, like in D&D, you have a set of attributes that you test essentially, but unlike in D&D, those attributes are very ambiguous and they overlap. And even in the rules, it says, in a certain circumstance, if you're trying to shoot somebody, maybe you'll use this attribute, but in certain circumstances, maybe this one will be more effective. And there's this huge kind of blurring between what those words mean. And the more that we've worked with this system, the more uh, admiration I have for the designers of Blades in the Dark, because just the way that they've used words to title those attributes is perfect. Like, there's a perfect amount of overlap in their meaning and ambiguity with other attributes. It's an exceptional work of linguistics to have achieved that, I think. But it also, as a player, it just makes things much more kind of uh, fun to improvise with. You're constantly thinking, well, I mean, okay, I need to do this thing. In most obvious circumstances, I'd use this attribute to test it, but I don't actually have as much. I don't have as many points in that attribute as I do in this other one. Can I make a case for how I'd use this other attribute to achieve this same end? And you end up, like trying to work out how you'd use brute force essentially to expertly snipe somebody, and trying to make those two things fit together is really thrilling. And especially if the GM is game for it and they're also trying to support you, it becomes kind of like much more collaborative.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there with phrasing it, making a case for, because I think that's what's super interesting about it. So taking one step back, right? There's when we talk about Blades in the Dark, sometimes people get the impression, those who haven't played it, that it's in some way less rulesy than Dungeons and Dragons, and it is, in the sense that the way the rules applied, the ways rules are applied, are about making a case for or having a conversation about. But the rules are incredibly tightly and specifically architected to make that plausible and to provide it with a set of constraints that means that you are not just going off the reservation. Right? There are checks and balances built within it. There are limitations. But the structure of play within it is less about working how you can stack a set of numbers to have the best advantage on a dice roll, although it is about that. It's more about a negotiation of how that makes sense narratively, which I think is just an amazing kind of extra step. So you should say that Blades in the Dark is based on the Powered by the Apocalypse stuff, which is something that we haven't played, but is foundational for this, where it was about moves, like things that your character could do that kind of really, really sort of changed the way it worked versus the way D&D worked. So D&D would be testing an attribute against the situation rather than saying, I'm going to do this cool thing and this is how I'm going to do it. And Blades in the Dark sort of took that and I think in some ways formalized it as well as sort of running with it. But I think what's really interesting about it as well is that in D&D, you can actually have this sort of antagonistic relationship between the GM and the players. Like the GM can throw a particularly hard monster at the players that might just kill them all, right? It might just sort of knock them out. And that could just be pure mathematical crunching. Like they could not have that much chance to beat the beholder because its hit dice are too high and it's just going to output too much damage and all the rest of it. In Blades in the Dark, that isn't a thing because players have a ton more agency because they can also use the narrative currency of stress to resist anything that happens. So if we come to a conclusion that your action may have this terrible consequence, like you'll set yourself on fire and drop off the top of a building, as has happened several times in our campaigns, you can also choose to say, I'm going to take the stress for me not being that injured by that, or I'm going to reduce the harm that does to me, or I'm going to say, I'm not killed by that, but I do, I am horribly injured, and that resistance mechanic, that ability to say, like, my character is going to increase their stress, but not suffer the consequences, means that players never have to accept the terrible thing. So in the sort of traditional crunchy RPGs that we talked about, a dice roll would hit you for a certain number of hit points, and that's that, right? Like, the cogs of the machine turn, and then it's on to somebody else's go. Blades in the Dark skips that, and it doesn't. That skipping it is the wrong way to say that. Just to say it transcends that almost, like it because it sort of ties it back, it builds it back into the story, and it gives the agency back to the player. And so there is this. And so while there could be an antagonistic relationship between players and GM, the GM setting up challenges for players to overcome in the D&D type stuff, it is far more skewed towards a collaborative finding out what happens with the GM and players in Blades in the Dark. And consequently, and this goes back to what we were saying about improvisation earlier in this chat, is that it is much easier as a GM to just sit down at the table and play to find out what happens in Blades in the Dark and related games, and not have to put in the sort of formal prep that you would want to do for a traditional game like D&D, just because of the way the system is set up, and just because of the way so much of it is going to come down to negotiations. And there's a lot of other stuff in there, right? A lot of Blades in the Dark is about just getting straight to the action. The whole idea of the engagement role, the idea that you don't really have to come up with a plan, you do it retrospectively. Blades in the Dark is the game designed around the motif of a heist movie like Ocean's 11, where it only explains how they pulled off the heist by continually flashing back to the things they did to set up the action.
Which is paid for out of the same currency of stress as well.
Right, exactly, yeah. So while it has a kind of free-form improv, delimiting and conversational approach, the formalization of that through the limits of stress and the sort of narrative currency and the number of dice that you have per action and stuff like that means that it is both freeing and improvisational and extremely crunchy, right? So it's almost like the best of both worlds in that sense, in that we still get the moments when you do the big dice roll and it just goes all horribly wrong, and also that kind of freedom to get out of the consequences of that, and to play with the consequences of that, and to take risks, and to do extraordinary things and to state that you want to do extraordinary things and then see if they come off. Like, I think even the way that rolls have different levels of worth so you might be rolling the same number of dice, but if it's a controlled situation or a risky situation or a desperate situation, changes the value of the dice roll, right? Like if it's a desperate situation, you screw up, it's really bad. And like that again, is again tied to it being plugged into the way that it tells things narratively. So
and there's gradations of failure as well. I mean, like the Genesis system, except with actual numbered dice rather than strange icons that are difficult to interpret. Only a 6 is outright success. And then 4 and 5 are success, but with a complication, which the GM has to improvise. And then 1 to 3 is failure. But just having that gradient is also just adds to the complexity and the improvisational aspect of playing the game.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating about that is because it combines a bunch of that stuff, like what is the value of the role, what kind of position am I in to take that action, how effective will that action be, can anyone help me? It becomes this, every action becomes a collaborative and group effort. Like I think so often in older RPGs, you are waiting for your turn, right? One person is rolling their dice to see what happens to them and the enemy they are fighting. In Blades, the GM never rolls, right? They are just there as this sort of enabler and arbiter, and can't think of the word, but like the person you're having the conversation with, the person you're kind of but it drags in everyone else around the table at the same time. Which I think is the reason why it ends up becoming so rich when we played it, and the reason that we were just so inspired and excited by it as a format and as a platform for making other games.
I do like. Oh well, sorry. Can I just mention 2 other things about Blades in the Dark that I think I like the fact that it incentivizes you through its advancement mechanics to do the most outlandish and dangerous things possible. Because only when you're rolling in a desperate situation, well, not only, but when you're rolling in a desperate situation, that's the opportunity for you to gain XP.
Right. Yeah.
And that just inevitably just moves the center of gravity towards incredibly foolish behavior, but which is perfectly right for the setting of this kind of elaborate heist where you want people to be doing excessive and ludicrous actions. And the other thing is that the consequence of the narrative currency of stress, when you take on more and more stress in order to escape the negative consequences that you might otherwise face. So you avoid injury by taking stress instead. When you max out stress, the consequence of that is also and to enrich the narrative, because instead of killing you, you gain a new character trait, essentially, which you then have to be conscious of when you're role-playing that character in the future, like a negative character trait. Like, I forget what exactly they are termed in Blades in the Dark, but
traumas, I believe.
Traumas, that's right. Yeah, so you can have a haunted look at all times, or or similar. And I think that's in a way, it's sort of transforming what would otherwise be a crunchy stat-based penalty into something much more interesting to actually engage with at the narrative level. But sorry, I interrupted you. I think you were going to make a segue, which I just pushed you off and drove into a wall.
Oh, that's okay. No, I think what's really interesting for me is that even though that Blades in the Dark has this incredibly kind of like prescriptive and specific application in terms of the rule set being built with a particular kind of play in mind, so this sort of heist storytelling, the rule set has been made available as Creative Commons system, and lots of games have been made based on it. It's become a new platform. It's become a new sort of stock system which is quite interesting given how esoteric and individualistic and
Mm.
far from the D&D tree it has fallen, that it should become so popular. And during the first lockdown, I played Band of Blades with Gillen and Hewitt and Gardner, and that was fascinating because it was quite a different system. So it's a military fantasy. It's this broken army basically losing the war against the Dark Lord and then having to flee from the hordes of undead. And each round is like a military mission, and you play both the officers back in the camp and the soldiers in the field. And those are different characters, and people will pick up and put down different characters. In a way that we haven't done with Blades, but could, right? Like you aren't necessarily attached to your character in Blades. The important thing is the gang, the group of scoundrels and what they're up to, less than the individual characters, and that's made super explicit in Band of Blades. And it was you were fighting monsters in that, and I think playing Band of Blades made me realize that adapting Blades in the Dark was going to be possible. Right, that it was going to be something that could be applied to a bunch of different settings in a bunch of different games. Because I think before that, was it before that? I'm pretty sure it was before that. We tried playing Scum and Villainy, which was the same rule set adapted to a kind of derivative Star Wars-y sci-fi setting.
I didn't find that worked, though.
We bounced off it really hard. Interestingly, Gardner, who I also play Band of Blades with, he has just finished a 60 episode game of Scum and Villainy, and his group had an absolute ball with it. And I said, but what about that terrible system? And he said, well, obviously I didn't run the terrible campaign setting. I came up with an awesome one of my own. And I was like, oh yeah, that's what I did wrong.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So just to dwell on Scum and Villainy for a second, I think one of the things that we found a mismatch between the Blades rule set and the setting was that Blades has a sort of pressure cooker feel to it. Like everybody's trapped in this fucking horrible city, and things are getting worse and worse and worse. And there was something about Scum and Villainy, the sort of planet hopping nature of it, which lost a lot of that sense of containment and direction and focus. Do you think, I mean, looking back at it and taking on what Gardner says, do you think that was the problem, or is it something else that we ascribe to that instead?
I mean, perhaps that quality in Blades was more important to our specific group than it was to others. Maybe, I don't know. Like, there's certainly a pressure cooker thing in Band of Blades as well, right? You've always got the enemy army just behind you, even though you're traveling across a landscape. You are constantly under pressure, and maybe I just didn't find a way to make that work in Scum and Villainy, and maybe I should have thrown away the setting it came with and come up with something that would work for our specific group. And I've heard other reports of that system being super great, and the fact that we bounced off it suggests that I just ran it poorly. I didn't do the work necessary to make it work. But I think you're right to identify the pressure cooker thing as being important for Blades, because it's what makes the stress mechanic really bite. And also the sort of factional stuff that takes place within it. So that's one of the things, one of the sort of undersold elements maybe of it, that is that every action causes this reaction amongst the other factions. So you're always going to piss somebody off because you're always stamping on somebody else's turf with each action that you make. Which I think maybe, I don't know, like maybe we need to find a way to bring that to life and make it work in Scum and Villainy.
We also played Cyberpunk as well.
Well, are we allowed to call it Cyberpunk? Because I think we literally have to call it CBR+PNK, because Cyberpunk is actually another RPG.
Yes, sorry, you're quite right. Yeah, it's a very cut down. Is it designed for one shots particularly? It feels like it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it was very much a one shot thing. So the setup in CBR+PNK is that you are operatives in a cyberpunk world on their doing their last job, and you're either going to be dead or retiring at the end of it. So it didn't have to have all the other structure that a campaign setting of that system, as it happens in Scum and Villainy and Blades in the Dark, does, right? So those in those systems, you have to have ways to stay under pressure from the other factions. You have to have ways for heat to rise, for your outfit to come under more pressure from the law or from other factions in the universe. But in CBR+PNK, you just end up dead or on fire, or or having made it, and and having done your last job, and having your mind transferred to an AI or whatever it is that you decide is your retirement. So yeah, it's just pure one shot where you burn through the stress narrative, because by the end of it, it doesn't matter, and you're gonna win or die. And I think we played 2 one shots of that, and they were both just breakneck and great fun.
Yeah,
And
really
again,
lent into the Blades thing of asking you or inviting you to do the most excessive thing possible at any moment. And that definitely happens in CBR PNK, where you're sort of backflipping off the bonnet of a moving hover vehicle to pirouette through the air while shooting people. Great fun.
yeah, it was really good, and it also it did the just playing to find out what happens thing brilliantly, in that it just gave you a bunch of parameters for how to set up, and then just off you went. No prep. You specifically don't do any prep. You're never going to encounter these characters again. Whatever. Like, where are you? At a party in a warehouse. What have you got to do? Kill the DJ. And it's just go.
Yeah.
And then you see what happens. And both times we played that, it was fantastic. I did do a tiny bit of prep on the first one, actually, because I was irritated that the prep that I did, I had an idea that you'd have like an orbital elevator going up into space, and that your last action would cause it to come crashing down to Earth. And I forgot to do that bit, which is the one bit I'd kind of prepared for it, which I still regret. Never mind. We had fun anyway.
We did. It was terrific. Great stuff. On the back of those experiences, you and I then decided to try and write our own setting for a sort of Blades-esque off-brand campaign. I can't remember the exact origins of it, but I think we fairly quickly honed in on wanting to do something in I think it was a fantasy world originally, right? It was a sort of
yeah, I think we were really into the sort of the monster hunting notion initially. I think was it. I think it was sort of a fantasy zone, like because the other game that's always been a huge influence on me is the Stalker video game, and that has a sense of pressure too, right? Like you're trapped in the zone, and there are factions that are all struggling to get what they want from that zone and colliding with each other, and it very much has that sense of a lot of moving parts within a confined system. So there's lots of things going on and colliding with each other, but no one can get out of the zone. No one can escape, kind of thing. They're all stuck in this pressure cooker of this hazardous environment. And then we ended up playing loads of Hunt Showdown as well, which doubled down on the same thing of the sort of monster hunting, magical bayou swamp situation. And we ended up. It's one of those things where everything seems sympathetic to everything else in terms of what we were interested in. And yeah, our original take was to do on Teeth was to do to a fantasy world, which you drew a beautiful fantasy world map for. Which I regret we won't be using, because we ended up moving it to 18th century England.
That was the right choice, though. I think
it definitely was, and I think it fits our own interests in terms of history and Englishness and horrible Englishness very well.
Yeah. So now what we have is a massive setting set in 18th century, somewhere in the north of England, some unnamed location somewhere in the north of England, which has been quarantined for many years following a terrible occult experiment which went horribly wrong and cursed the entire location. And the players are professional monster hunters who are hired by the crown to go in and keep things sort of on an even keel, essentially killing monsters, yes, and helping the people there to some extent, but largely for the purposes of the crown's continuing mining of the area for occult resources. So you're not necessarily good people, and on top of that, you also have a hidden agenda, which might be anything from raising a dead god to destroying England itself.
Maybe both, right?
Or
Why not
maybe
both?
both at the same time. Yeah, but it's interesting the development of this because as we kind of built on the rules that we wanted, we found that some of the things that we were trying to achieve with the setting weren't actually that kind of simpatico with the systems. For example, one of the things that makes Blades so exciting to play is it's sort of getting you into the heart of the action, where you are plunged essentially into a scenario. There's a role to determine how well the scenario is going in media res, and then you can sort of do flashbacks to say how you got here and how you prepared for this particular eventuality and so forth. So it drops you right in it. But one of the things that we were thinking of doing originally was more of a sort of procedural investigatory thing where you're coming to a scene of some horrific carnage and then you're sleuthing your way through it, essentially like almost like the Sherlock Holmes Hound of the Baskervilles sort of scenario. But that doesn't quite work with the systems that Forged in the Dark presents, because it wants to kind of constantly push you forward through that sort of stuff and have you decide it essentially quickly in retrospect. Were there other things in the rule set that you felt you were sort of baked into Forged in the Dark that didn't that you had to sort of overcome or work around or adapt yourself to?
Yeah, I think what I was most pleased with is in the end. So, Blades in the Dark sort of leans on this sort of phase system. So you have a sort of info. So you learn what you're going to do. You're going to go and break into a house or whatever, and then you have an information gathering phase, which is quite light and is very quick. It's not making a plan; it's just sort of getting some information together, and we as you say, wanted to kind of get the sense of a slightly more procedural thing across in Teeth, and so we've done something similar, but we had to work quite hard to make what we've called the investigation phase have a little bit more meat to it. So that's slightly more to chew on there in terms of how you did that information gathering and what that means for the game. So in Blades, it only affects the engagement roll. So it's literally just the starting situation. You go straight in and, did you bribe the guard last night? And if the engagement roll fails, actually you tried to bribe him, but he took the money and still brought more of his mates to beat you up, so that the situation's immediately bad. Or maybe it did work and it went well. But we've done a little bit more than that in terms of if you're up against a monster, perhaps you open up an opportunity to have a more classic kind of monster of the week type flashback where you're looking at the kind of ritual that you've done to overcome the monster's special powers, or so we've set up a couple of other systems, but I think judging those and getting that exactly right was the thing that was most challenging for us, because we also wanted to capture the sense of you being in this sort of eerie English landscape, and have you traveling across it. So working out where to place the phase within that, and still allow for this jumping straight into the action kind of play that Blades is so good at. That was a really tricky balancing act. I'm really pleased with this sort of final draft we're doing at the minute, because I think it nails that really well. But it did take a back and forth of a bunch of play testing for us to sort of say, to realize where that would work. So I think it was that Blades is such a specific and so well tuned piece of sort of gaming architecture that, just pulling out one bit of the arch made a lot of it fall down, and then it was more challenging than I'd realized to place those back in a way that was sympathetic to that design, but also kept the kind of mechanical backing for the thing that we wanted to create ourselves, that had this kind of sense of wilderness, this sense of hardship in a rainy, cold northern England setting, and also have this slightly kind of sense of hunting down your quarry or preparing to break into a haunted manor or any of the other sort of challenges that we put in Teeth. And all of that's been like a really interesting learning experience, which has been backed up by us doing some one-shots and smaller campaigns. Right, so we started with Night of the Hogmen, which was delightful in that it was like CBR+PNK was a pure one-shot, right? Like it was designed to be played a single time, and those characters aren't going to persist or continue. Although someone did feedback saying that they were using them in another game, which was really pleasing because they liked those characters so much they went on to use them again. But I thought that was really interesting in that the action system that we like so much was really easy to tug out of Blades in the Dark and make operate on its own. And what was challenging was placing that back into a campaign structure that worked for the kind of fiction that we're trying to tell, which I should have seen coming, right? Because some of the problems with Band of Blades were that the campaign arc didn't necessarily quite work. So I don't think any of us had really taken to understanding the fact that Band of Blades had an end of game scenario which judged you on how well you'd done in a number of settings. So I generally played this kind of like general lead character, and I always, because the zombie horde was behind us, right? The undead army is breathing down our neck. So I was constantly like, right, let's move on as quick as we can so that we get to the big fortress with plenty of time. But actually what I should have been doing is taking lots of risks to hang around to try and get the special items and special points that in the end game decided whether we were ultimately overrun and destroyed or whether we had succeeded in holding back the horde. And so actually, even though we got to the castle that you have to get to at the end and fortified it and did really well in the defense of it, overall we failed because we hadn't taken enough risks earlier on. And I don't think anyone, I mean, it's not super clear in the book, and the group hadn't really kind of understood that was what was required of them. And I think in rule sets generally, knowing what is required of you, what's required of you to, what is expected of you, what should you be doing with these rules, what should you be doing with this setting, that's the thing that you've got to make super clear. And it's the thing that both players and GM have to buy into. And I think that was the thing that was sort of from working on the Teeth campaign setting, which we spent quite some time doing now. That was the thing that was the longest sort of journey and the biggest education in terms of what do we actually need to tell the players and the GM, and how do we do it in a way that both sells this idea of 18th century monster hunting that we've got and supports that fiction in a way that keeps the sort of magic of that improv and freedom of play that makes that system really compelling in the first place. And I think that's been, I think that's actually ended up being really successful. But yeah, it's been a real kind of, especially with us doing the one shots beforehand, it's been this kind of like evolving learning process, which has been really, really quite profound. Like I think it's sort of, I think it almost feel like it's changed me as a GM and a writer. Like I've got perspective on stuff from a sort of development sense, in a similar way to like making a game ends up, making a video game ends up changing some stuff about how you view, playing games. The experience of playing games ends up being changed a bit when you understand more about how cameras are implemented or how movement works, or all that kind of game design stuff. When you see behind the curtain a bit more, you end up appreciating it in a different way. And I definitely feel like what we've done has changed me both as a writer and as a GM. And also as someone who pays attention to rules and reads them, right? Like really understanding how rules fit together as a larger structure has been something that has, I feel like I'm better at now, and paid more kind of like specific attention to, which I perhaps didn't when it was easy to gloss over that just running it as a GM. We'll just leave that bit out.
Yeah, you can't really house rule your own rules, can you?
No, exactly. In fact, I think there's a note in the document where I did suggest that the GM house rule, and a friend who was reading it said, "Yeah, I don't think you should. You shouldn't invite them to write their own rules." I was like, "Yeah, no, we really shouldn't."
So one of the things we sort of semi-accidentally achieved by doing the one-shots, because we sort of like paused development on the full rule set and then focused on doing something like much smaller scale and stripped back, we ended up sort of creating this on-ramp for the actual campaign itself. I don't think that was your intention or my intention when we started thinking about Night of the Hogmen, but it's like this very fast-paced, incredibly low prep one-shot. It's got very simplified rules, and we ended up creating something that was like actually a really good primer for Blades style games themselves. And then when we moved on from that, I mean, that's to explain Hogmen a little bit. It's this sort of breakneck escape from a horde of mutant pigs, and the game sort of basically bounces players through a bunch of little vignettes towards its denouement. And because that's sort of narrow focus and it's very structured, it makes it very kind of grokkable for new players and like new role players entirely, I think. And then when we moved on to Blood Cotillion, we sort of enlarged that. There's a few more rules, has a lot more kind of it's a lot more free form, but it's also still focused on a single location and a single evening, in which the players attempt to assassinate these cultists at a ball, sort of like a Hitman level, but as a role playing game. And then the third module we released was Stranger and Stranger, which is like a mini campaign. It's much more open ended. There's lots and lots of material the GM can draw on optionally, and the players are this band of villagers who get increasingly horribly corrupted across the course of the adventure, and they have to find some way to save their village from destruction by a monstrous creature before their own mutations become unmanageable. And I think with each of these, we've sort of opened up the scope, we've added complexity and freedom, and I think you could probably take someone who's never played a role playing game before and sort of bounce them through these modules in sequence and end up with a player who is, ready to go on a on a full fat rulebook, ideally of teeth, for the interests of our bank balance. But I think it would apply to really any role playing game. It's just a sort of a good ramp. Now that's just a service we perform for the world out of the profound goodness of our hearts.
Do you know, Ollie, who is a regular group, Ollie Skillman Wilson, who's a regular member of our group, had never played any RPG of any kind before he played Blades in the Dark.
Mm.
And I wonder how that will structure his experience of RPGs generally. And I've chatted to him about alternatives, and we've actually played something close to D&D now, like one of the OSR rule sets, as they're called. And he's very lukewarm on them, and I wonder whether, having come from this direction, he will never play D&D, and consequently will never have the kind of perspective on it, with this idea as D&D as a baseline that we have. But yeah, I'm digressing really from the point there. Although Ollie did help enormously in testing teeth and was one of the most entertaining players, because he's extremely inventive and original in his play. And one of the sort of themes in Teeth, the big teeth in the campaign setting, is this idea that you have a sort of group agenda, and on top of that, you can have a personal agenda which should be related to it. So, for example, they were a group who were in it for money, and their motivation was to get rich and get out before they were horribly corrupted. And it leads to this kind of inventive horror comedy. I'm not sure whether it was us that called it this or somebody else, but it was this idea of it sort of The Witcher meets Blackadder. So it's got that kind of, it's very English, but it's got quite kind of, it's got the monster hunting vibes that can stretch to being quite eerie and serious at the same time. And one of the things that was great in that is in the one of the opening adventures, Ollie had declared that he was a sort of taxidermist, and his plan for making money from the creatures of the Vale, the monsters they were killing, was to preserve them and stuff them and sell them on. And and on the fly during one of the play tests, he came up with one of the best sequences I've ever seen, where they were fighting in a brickworks, and so he surmised that there must be a kiln in which the bricks are fired. And I said, yes, of course there is. And the creatures that they were fighting were formed of clay and mud and other detritus, and so he lured them into the kiln, sealed it up, fired the kiln, and then, of course, had the creatures preserved as themselves, as pottery, that he could then put on a barge and ship off to his benefactors in London to make a hefty bit of cash. But I feel like that sequence was emblematic of like the improvisational richness of the setting, and also the kind of comedy of it as well, because it was a really funny, brilliant sequence of roleplay.
Right. Yeah. I think that a lot of that comedy we sort of baked it into the setting. Obviously, Ollie's improvisation is another level of player invented silliness, but like, I feel like there's a lot of comedy in the actual writing itself, or at least, I think it's funny. But there's grotesquerie there, but there's also absurdity and farce, and like it's as much influenced by the League of Gentlemen and Monty Python as it is by any pure horror text. But I feel like, and this is sort of like, this question will like maybe bring us out of teeth and back into larger role playing experiences, but I feel like that's not really just exclusive to our experience in the setting, but it just seems generally true of all the role-playing adventures that you and I have had, where there's always like, it's always deeply macabre in some way, but there's often a very slapstick element to the proceedings. And you've played with many more groups than I have, and is that just what happens generally, or is that something that just is true to our group and no one else?
I think it's more true of our group. I have played with groups who've taken it quite seriously, and I've played with other groups where it has oscillated back and forth. I mentioned that I played with a D&D group that ran for 10 years, and they took it quite seriously, and they had some real tragedies, like like tragic death sequences, love affairs, things like that went on in their games, and they took that quite seriously, and they catalogued it all. But also, in one of the sessions when I played with them, some kind of anti-magic creature dispelled a pocket dimension filled with naked dwarves, which were then sprayed over a battlefield, landing as we fought these anti-magic giants, which was one of the funniest sequences of anything that I've ever encountered, and the whole table was struggling to breathe as they were dealing with that, because it was just so beautiful. So yeah, I think, it depends on the GM, it depends on the setting. It was sort of going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, could you really play Vampire the Masquerade in a really funny way, or would you have to take it a bit more seriously?
Yeah, I don't think you. Yes, I don't think you could. I feel like
So
I was a bit mean about Vampire the Masquerade earlier, actually. I don't know. There are things I really like about the setting, and obviously the fascism thing is a problem for me. But then, there's something very evocative about cities at night, and it's very divorced from the sort of the antics or farce that can happen in role playing settings. But it's just, there's something very evocative and powerful and moving, I think, about being on your lonesome in a city at night, where there's just a sense of opportunity, but also danger, but also a sense of relief from the modern world and its busyness.
Do you know, I was just going back to your point there on silliness and on settings and stuff. I wonder because one of the really beautiful games that I love deeply that we sort of bounced off when we tried it, which was Symbaroum.
Mm,
Now, lots of people aren't familiar with Symbaroum, but the setting is one of the most beautiful settings, largely,
yeah.
partly because of the writing, largely because of the incredible artwork by a chap called Martin Grip, who paints throughout that. And the presentation of the Symbaroum books is a really strong argument for one artist doing the whole thing, right? Because it just gives it,
Mm.
it it just imbues it with this kind of incredible sense of smoky, mysterious visuals. But we bounced off that partly because I think the rules set didn't really gel with us, um, it's one of those settings that I long for a second edition. But what
Mm.
actually happened was that it was converted to fifth edition D&D,
I know
which
it
is
feels
not
like
what.
they recognized there was a problem, but came up with the wrong solution. Uh,
Yeah, I really feel like the advanced player's guide and the core rulebook for that could have been merged into a single
mm,
book with a really heavy edit, because they are just such magnificent books and they're so beautiful. I've got them on my shelf here, and I love them. And I do want to try playing Symbaroum again, perhaps with a
yeah.
different group, because I think one of the things is we are so inclined to comedy and farce in our groups that actually the very somber tone of Symbaroum didn't quite work for us because we were
Yeah.
taking it quite seriously, and a lot of the spell descriptions are very dark. The situation is quite grim.
I
Um,
think I was playing a goblin with an unsavory enthusiasm for strangulation, so I don't know that I fully committed to the seriousness of the setting. But you're
exactly,
right.
yeah.
I mean,
That's
it was a disconnect for me because looking at that book, it's beautiful and there's something very powerful about this dank wilderness of forest. It's can just sea of wood, um, and yet I mistakenly probably brought to it our usual nonsense, and that was perhaps a mistake.
I mean, the option is there to play a goblin, right? So
Yeah,
you were going to do that
and I do have
all
busy
along.
hands. What can I say?
But it is even the goblins in it themselves are they're even those those comedy characters of our enjoyment of fantasy tropes are tragic in it because they
Mm,
only live for a few years and
yeah,
mature really quickly and are taken advantage of by all the other races because they're quite dim and all this kind of stuff, which is it's all quite sad. And like the ogres in it, they sort of emerge cluelessly from the forest. They don't know where they came from.
oh,
Elves in it are
oh,
these
yeah, sinister.
hideous kind of grim forces of nature that evolve and become just more and more monstrous as they get older. Everything about it is sort of you know traditional fantasy tropes, but corrupted and dark. And
Mm,
I think it was just a bit too grimdark for our group. We needed to take it a little bit more lightheartedly, didn't we?
yeah,
One of the things I would say about Symbaroum as well, I think perhaps one of the other reasons that we bounced off a little, is that the what the sort of what the game wants you to do is not super clear. Like it is a very general, lightweight rule set, but it is a game about surviving this incredibly dangerous forest. And I'd never felt like it imposed rules that, or I don't know, provided rules, maybe not imposed, it's not the right word, but it never provided this like a rule set that made sense for me in terms of it being, oh my goodness, we've got to survive this incredibly hostile environment of a cursed alien forestscape.
mm,
And also it strongly implied that you were supposed to do dungeon crawling and go into tombs, but it didn't feel like an RPG that was a dungeon crawler. Right, there's a lot of games
yeah.
that are set up, like the big one for going into dungeons and fighting monsters. And although there are fantastic monsters in it and fantastic context for dungeons and stuff, it didn't feel like a game that necessarily invited that, which
Well,
is a bit of a
yeah,
strange tension within the rule set and the setting.
yeah. The forest itself was just one gigantic dungeon in a
Mm,
way. It's a sort of strength of the setting, and it's also its weakness because it is the idea of this sea of forest is powerful and inviting, but at the same time, there's no there's innately no structure to a forest. that so there's I mean I'm sure in your adventure you had planned out some navigable routes between narrative points for us,
mm.
but like as a player it was just it was just trees. and it wasn't clear, what the objectives were in that, because it's just this unknowable, mysterious place. And
Mm.
I felt like we were wandering in there without really a huge sense of defined purpose. Like we had objectives actually, but in terms of like there was no kind of spatial sense to it that you could really grok. And I think actually that's
Mm.
kind of oddly important to me. Maybe that's just because I obsess over maps, but like
It
um
is an odd map, isn't it?
mm,
The map is very odd. It is this sort of this a bit of civilization along the bottom and along the left hand side, and then just a vast
yeah.
forest that implies nothing.
Well, it's a map
Um,
with a giant hole in it,
which is
basically.
which is weird because it's incredibly evocative and yet sort of slightly off-putting at the same time. I think
Yeah.
you're right. I think you're right. There are odd tensions and difficulties within Symbaroum that I wish were. I mean, I know why they did that, because it was this the intention to give the GM and the players a
Mm.
really big blank canvas based off this sort of rich and exciting initial fiction, which is great. It's just a really fantastic setting. But yeah, I do. I feel like it's one of the ones that needs to be revisited, and it didn't land for us, which was a tragedy for me, because it's one of my sort of favorite games to look at and leaf through. And going back to what I said earlier about the monster books always being exciting, as an amazing monster
Mm.
codex with some fantastic stuff in it. It's actually Symbaroum is one of those RPGs that highlights for me that um, buying and collecting RPG hardbacks can be its own hobby. You don't have to play them. You can enjoy the hobby of owning these incredibly lavish productions and their beautiful books.
Did you want to talk about Mothership a little bit more? Because we did mention it earlier and said we would return to it. And there's a new
Yeah,
version of it coming out, right? We played an early beta version of it, which we had
yeah.
some trouble with, but I'm excited to go back to that as
I am
well.
as well, actually. Yeah. So it had they did a Kickstarter for it after having done this sort of open release. So they released the rule set for free, and then there were a bunch of paid modules and things. And we played one of the modules with that rule set. And the Kickstarter went absolutely gangbusters, raised huge amounts of money. I think both myself and Alex ended up backing that, so we'll have a couple of copies of it when it comes to it. Um, but it had this incredible sense of um, tying together tropes from a lot of classic space horror movies. So it felt a bit like Aliens, it felt a bit like Event Horizon, and it felt like you could really do a lot with that. And some really great writers produced fantastic modules for it that had a kind of sense of sort of 70s and 80s cinema doom to them. Um, and I've never seen our group take a situation as seriously as when you were boarding one of the derelict ships,
Yeah.
um, like tentatively exploring it. I think nothing happened in our first session, and yet everyone was on the edge of their seat because they were expecting terrible horrors.
Well, the weird,
Um,
and there's a tension there because in horror films, the characters are stupid, right? They throw themselves
mm,
into danger. They always split up. What's that knocking in the cellar? I'll go down there by myself with my torch that doesn't work properly. You can't.
yeah,
It's very hard to get into that headspace as a player who has some desire to preserve their character. And yet that is the kind of motor which makes a lot of these horror films work, is it's just the dipshittery of their actual protagonists. And I couldn't quite get into that, and I think that made us very tentative in a way which was tense and definitely exotic in terms of the kinds of games we normally play, but also probably sludged up our progress in a way which was maybe unhelpful to you as the GM.
I don't know. I think it was a really interesting change of pace for us, because interestingly, it was closer to that sort of dungeon crawling experience than we normally play. We
Mm,
normally play quite open, mad heists and chases, and you know going to a party and all these kinds of things. And there was a dead spaceship on which board everyone on board which everyone was already dead, and you were exploring it, and it was incredibly tense and slow. And I really enjoyed that because it was such a great change of pace.
mm,
I think that edition of Mothership had a bunch of slightly confusing, similarly named terms like fear and stress and things that
yeah.
were distinct. Um, currencies and stats and stuff, but didn't. But it became a little bit confusing. As I understand it, from having read a lot of the updates from the Kickstarter, they've taken on board a huge amount of that sort of feedback and have tackled it in this new edition. So I'm really interested to go with it. But we quickly adapted it, though. I think. I mean, there was a blog that one of us found that had another group's house rules that they'd posted up,
Yeah.
and we immediately adopted several of those. And I think that improved and sort of sustained the experience.
Because one of the main problems with the rules out of the box is that it's a game that generates characters who are very much like the characters out of Alien, essentially useless space nobodies who are destined to die horribly, which makes sense given the kind of pitch for it. But it's also quite frustrating in terms of player agency, because it was basically impossible to do anything. Like as a pilot of a spaceship, no role I could make had a better than 50% chance of success. And then things got worse. So it was sort of vexing. But then I think we did fix it by house ruling it a bit. And also maybe we didn't approach it in exactly the right way. I've heard other people say that, in fact, we should have just rolled very, very rarely. We should have only rolled in extremis, and everything else we would just accept happened.
I think that's a classic mistake on the GM's part that I still make regularly, is expecting dice rolls when you don't need to make them. And it's something I've written in every single thing that we've produced. Don't make a dice roll unless it's you have to. It's really about something. And I still make that mistake when running, because it's just exciting to snatch up a handful of dice and make the roll and see what happens. Inject that capricious moment of the polyhedrals coming up.
I tell you what, one thing I'd like from future Mothership modules is greater delineation between the kinds of space terror that are available. Because I like Mothership can obviously do Alien, it can do Event Horizon, and it can do even like fairly outre 70s pulp sci-fi cover weirdness. And I don't all think those things would fit in the same film, and I don't know that they all fit in the same module. But maybe there are dedicated modules which sort of drill down into the themes of one or more of those, because then you get this like Alien is just really grounded. It's incredibly grounded, all from the chunky buttons on the dashboards, the way that characters talk over one another, and even the Alien, which is like this unknowable terror, but it's also very physical, very real. It's kind of alarmingly sexual and organic in ways that are perversely familiar. And all of that is very different, I think, from the operatic, metaphysical, unhinged nonsense of Event Horizon. And I don't think you can put those two things side by side, although fucking Ridley Scott has tried, which is one of the reasons that the new films absolutely fucking suck, I think. But
yeah. I mean, there's a wealth of different approaches to Mothership, and I think I would actually try. There are some much weirder, as you say, more metaphysical modules out there, written by some really great RPG writers. So, I think we would go from the sort of claustrophobic space horror that we were playing, and perhaps try some other angles as we go into it. And as I say, maybe it's not a campaign. Maybe we play a bunch of a couple of sessions and everyone dies. And which is a popular motif in games over the past few years, to have that kind of disposability, and it can make for a great one shot, a great short experience if everyone's playing for death, as it were. And I know what you mean, though. As a group, I think we really value our characters and don't want them to die. And but maybe that's the thing that injects the tension when we are faced with those kind of situations where that sort of loss is almost inevitable.
I'd like to hear you talk about two other RPG systems, particularly Agon and particularly DIE, because I haven't experienced either of these, and they sound very cool. Agon's by the same people who made Blades in the Dark. perhaps you should explain it.
So Agon is what Mr. John Harper, who created Blades in the Dark, did next, and it's a fascinating sort of cooperative competition-based system. And so Agon itself is Greek heroes, and I was a bit trepidatious starting it out because I love Blades in the Dark quite a lot. And from what I'd read of Agon, what people had said about it, I thought, oh, that sounds a bit complicated. And when I looked through the rules, I was like, oh, that is quite quite formidable. It's a really dense rule set. But the consequence of that is that it creates Greek heroes with an interwoven story within minutes. And when we started our campaign, we had very quickly created believable, coherent Greek heroes with their own patrons and gods who held a grudge against them, and so on. And so as you play, it's another dice pool system, but with lots of different dice this time, not rather than the sort of a fistful of d6s. You visit the sort of the classic pantheon of lots of different polyhedral dice, but you generate that dice pool through a bunch of different things, using the favor of the gods, but also using your name and your epithet, and the sort of I can't think of the word, but the area that your hero is most proficient in. And then as you roll the dice, you'll face a situation. Each of the heroes will roll, and then the one who does the worst goes first in describing what's happened. Then it goes through the group until the most successful of the heroes describes how they finally fully vanquish the situation you're up against. So, for example, the three of us were tackling some harpies that were attacking a Greek village on this island, and my character failed completely to do what they were trying to do. So I described the way I'd heroically leapt from rooftop to rooftop and then crashed through the rooftop into some terrified villager's kitchen, and then the next person up described how they battled the harpies by climbing a tree and grabbing one by the foot, and then the final one was firing blazing arrows or something that saw them off. And what's fantastic about it is it lends itself to this sort of ancient Greece feel by deciding who is best, right? So you're all slightly egotistical, not even slightly egotistical, like wildly egotistical Greek heroes, who want to be sung about, want their stories told. And so you are up to who is best. You decide each round, and I am best. And so the glory that you get from winning these encounters is literally the XP. So the XP system is called glory, and the more glorious you are in your actions, the more you advance, and the more you unlock the favor of the gods, and the greater the epithet you can apply to yourself, and therefore the bigger dice attached to it, and so on. Which just as Blades is sort of incredibly finely tuned to tell those kind of steampunk high stories, Agon does that for the classic Greek myth. And again, John Harper sort of opened that up to people to be able to make things from it, and himself is making playbooks and rule sets based on that for something else. And what I think is amazing is the next up thing that he's done is LA Street Gang. So basically, Fast and Furious will be the next, the adaptation of that. So going from Greek heroes to street racers.
Well, isn't the Fast Saga the new epic poem?
Exactly, yeah, and it seems so right, like the who is best, amongst Greek heroes, but also against, amongst LA street racers. It just made me laugh out loud when I saw it because it made such a beautiful sense. But it is inspired, Agon. It is one of the most extraordinary works of game design I've encountered. I think Chris Gardner from Fellbetter ended up running it, and I think it was quite taxing for him to do so because you had to get on top of the rules and prepare some stuff. So it's nothing like as light or as immediate as Blades in the Dark, but enormously interesting in the same way. And so the other person in that group was Kieran Gillen, long-time comrade from
father of games journalism.
Yes,
Inventor of comics.
he did invent comics. It's true. So one of the comics he invented is called Die, which is a satirical take. Is it satirical? Yeah, I suppose it's certainly a meta breakdown of RPG stuff, which is almost sort of a commentary on his own life, because it's about a group that played as teens returning to their game in later life, and like the D&D cartoon, it's about becoming trapped inside the game, being dragged into the game world for real. And it places the GM as a character within the game world. So you, as the game kicks off, you create your persona, which are the players who are playing the game, and then they have their personas within the world. So you are creating the player who's playing the game as well as the character, which all sounds incredibly convoluted, but the genius of the way he's done it is that it is gently prompted together by a series of questions that teases out who you are, what you're interested in, and then that ends up creating the relationships between the players, and then creating the characters themselves. So we had a group that were had relationships that were involved around a convention for the Robin Hood TV series that came out in the 1980s, and they were the people that ran those conventions, and they become quite incestuous, and there was bitter recriminations back and forth and so on. And it was very funny. It was the Die comics are quite dark. There's some real psychodrama in them. In the session that we ran, I think it's partly because of the group we were, but also it shows the sort of flexibility of it, that it was very, very funny, with Gillen sending up classic fantasy tropes, and the world is destroyed essentially at the end with you facing down the GM character, who is a psychopath, of course, and has all these kind of extraordinary powers. And it's interesting the way he like all of the rule set almost is, because it is an original and unique rule set, but it is all based around the sort of iconic material that makes up RPGs. So each player gets one version of the dice. So like one character class is a D8, one's a D6, and so on. And that dice is specifically tied to the kind of abilities that they have, and only they get to roll it. And there's a little ceremony where your dice is physically handed to you as the game kicks off.
Oh, wow.
And it's the fact that he's been able to be so theatrical and play with the tropes that naturally have emerged from this stuff that makes it so compelling and so funny. And the fact that we know these kinds of people, we've grown up with this stuff and this mythos, and Gillen did an enormous amount of research in this. He's got piles of books that about like the early D&D scene in the 1970s, all this kind of stuff, which all fed into it. And it's almost academic in a sense, while also being really sort of silly and funny and chaotic in the way that Gillen's writing is. I mean, obviously, we were really lucky to have the creator of the thing running the session for us. But it feels like every group is going to get some kind of weird, chaotic psychodrama out of that system.
I'd be slightly worried that it would turn into like performance therapy, and I think that might be. You need to be careful who you play it with.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I think that's a real risk. But also, it could end up being. I mean, ours I think was because we made up such outlandish characters, they didn't end up being about us personally as people, but we did create some really interesting fucked up characters and their relationships and explored those. Everyone around at the table was a writer, so it had a certain amount of energy from that, I think. But we ended up watching a guy playing U2's a sort of a man perhaps in his early 50s with a little pork pie hat playing U2's One on a ukulele as the closing moment to that adventure, which I think sort of summarizes the flavor of the experience.
A couple of questions just to close out. How would you convince someone who is resistant to the idea that they should play role-playing games? What would your sales pitch for role-playing be?
Well, we did trick somebody into playing it a few years ago, where they said, "Oh, I like board games," and of course, you can play Dungeons and Dragons, for example, and plenty of other systems with some little miniatures and a hex map or a tile map on the table, and very much pretend that it is a board game. But then just get to ask them some questions and pull them into the narrative. And I think the ease with which people find themselves answering those questions and realizing, oh, actually, I can do this. I think generally it's a sort of anxiety. Oh, I'm not sure if I can. I don't know whether I'm going to embarrass myself. I'm not sure if I want to do it. And if you can just get them past that first hurdle, then generally people get it, because it is based on the games we played as children, but we're adults now, kind of thing. It is doable, but I can understand why some people will never take that step, which is a tragedy, in my view.
What would your pitch be for playing not D&D games to people who just play D&D?
Variety is the spice of life, right? And there are just so many incredible pieces of work. And I think the thing to remember, I think quite often the reason people don't come out of the D&D ecosystem, as you mentioned earlier, is because they feel like they have learned and mastered a rule set. They don't want to have to do it again. And so many of these systems can be learned incredibly quickly or piecemeal over time. And they just offer such a breadth of not just fictions, but the way rule sets support fictions. And I mean, if there's one thing I hope we got out of this conversation, it's articulating that many rule sets support fictions in mechanical ways that are super interesting and are nothing like the way you experience things through the rule sets of Dungeons and Dragons. And in the same way that if all games were Monopoly, we would live in hell. There's way more to that RPG scene than the D&D rule set, and getting past that, you will just open up some big horizons. Play Night of the Hogmen, as you say. That I think that I don't think we've mentioned this anywhere, that it is actually a really good onboarding, introductory, light thing. I know we've literally mentioned it now in this podcast, but I don't think we mentioned it anywhere in our fiction promoting our work, that it is very much this kind of welcoming onboarding thing. So
come for the Hogmen,
try it.
Stay for the pies, the cursed pies. If you'd like to check out Hogmen or any of our other modules that we've released, there's 3 of them. Hogmen is free, or at least pay what you want. You can do so by going to teethrpg.itch.io. They're all there, and you can probably find information about our forthcoming mega setting there as well. We also have a newsletter, which is cool. teethrpg.substack.com, which you can sub to, and you can get various musings on role-playing stuff, news, as well as information about the status of Big Teeth, the main setting, which should hopefully go into Kickstarter soon-ish? Question mark.
Yeah.
If you'd like to tweet us, you can do so by tweeting at Crit and Crowbar. If you'd like to tweet Jim, you can tweet at Jim Rossignol. If you find his name to be disquietingly Bonapartist, it is in the show notes, spelt correctly. These recordings are uploaded as videos to YouTube, where you can find other nonsense by us. The address for that is youtube.com/crateandcrowbar. And thanks as always to our backers on Patreon. You can back us too at patreon.com/crateandcrowbar, or you can join our Discord community, the link for which is on our website, crateandcrowbar.com. I've been Marsh Davis.
And I, Jim Rossignol.
Fare thee well, travellers.
Bye.